Rain hammered against the windshield of Sarah Martinez's 1928 Ford Model A as she drove along the dirt road connecting the small rural towns of interior Texas, about 40 kilometers north of Austin. It was nearly 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in October 1930, and she was returning home after a double shift at the Moonlight Diner, a small restaurant that stayed open late to serve farm workers and the occasional travelers passing through the region. The Ford's engine rumbled with the effort of crossing the mud puddles forming on the unpaved road. Sarah gripped the steering wheel firmly, her fingers calloused from hard work, evidencing the 6 years she had spent as a waitress since arriving in Texas from New Mexico. At 28 years old, she had learned to be independent out of necessity, fleeing an arranged marriage her parents had tried to force when she was only 19. The year 1930 had been particularly difficult for everyone in the region. The Great Depression was just beginning to show its devastating effects, and many local farms were already facing hardships. Cotton prices had plummeted, and several families Sarah knew were losing their land to banks. The diner where she worked was one of the few businesses still managing to stay afloat, mainly because the owner, a German immigrant named Heinrich Müller, had managed to keep prices low and attract a loyal clientele of rural workers. Sarah wore a simple navy blue cotton dress, already faded from many washings, covered by a white apron that still smelled of bacon and coffee. Her brown hair was pulled back in a low bun, some loose strands framing her tired face. She dreamed of saving enough money to move to a bigger city, perhaps Dallas or Houston, where she could find work in a hospital as a nursing assistant, a profession that had always interested her, but required training she couldn't afford. The storm had begun during her night shift, transforming the rural roads into rivers of red mud, characteristic of Texan soil. Her Ford's kerosene headlights cut through the darkness with a weak, yellowish light, illuminating the rain falling in dense curtains. Sarah knew this route well. It was the only path to her small rented house on the outskirts of Cedar Creek, a town with fewer than 500 inhabitants, consisting mainly of a main street with some shops, a Methodist church, and dozens of small rural properties. The car radio, a luxury she had managed to buy used the previous year, played softly from an Austin station broadcasting jazz music and news. The announcer spoke about the New York stock market crash the previous year and its continuing effects on the national economy. Sarah turned the volume down. News about the economic crisis only increased her anxiety about the future. That's when she saw something strange ahead. Initially, Sarah thought it was one of the Morrison farm's horses that had escaped during the storm. A dark shape lay fallen on the roadside, partially illuminated by her car's weak headlights. She slowed down, straining her eyes in the darkness. Her heart raced when she realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person. A man lay on his side in the muddy shoulder, his clothes soaked by the rain. Even from a distance, Sarah could see dark stains that appeared to be blood on his white shirt, now transparent from the water. The man wasn't moving, and there was no sign of an automobile or wagon nearby. Sarah stopped the Ford at the roadside, leaving the engine running and headlights on. Her hands trembled as she searched for the kerosene lantern she always carried in the car, a necessity in an era when rural roads were completely dark at night. For a moment she hesitated. A woman alone on the road at night was always in danger, and stopping to help a stranger could be dangerous. But her Christian conscience, shaped by the Methodist teachings of her childhood, wouldn't allow her to simply drive on. She lit the lantern and got out of the car, immediately being drenched by the cold October rain. Her dress stuck to her body, and she pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders as she cautiously approached the fallen figure. "Sir, are you all right?" Sarah shouted over the noise of the rain, keeping the lantern raised. The man didn't respond. Sarah moved closer, the lantern's yellow light revealing disturbing details. He appeared to be between 35 and 40 years old, dark hair wet and stuck to his forehead, wearing clearly expensive clothes. A bloodied white linen dress shirt, good quality dark wool pants, and leather shoes that appeared to be custom-made. His clothes were the type only very wealthy men could afford. completely out of place on that rural Texas road. "Sir, can you hear me?" Sarah knelt beside him in the mud, checking if he was still breathing. To her relief, she could see his chest rising and falling slowly. He was alive, but clearly needed urgent medical help. There were visible cuts on his face and arms, and a particularly large blood stain on his abdomen. His hands were injured, as if he had fought with someone. Even more disturbing, Sarah noticed he wore a heavy gold ring with a symbol she didn't recognize, something that looked like an eagle with spread wings. The man groaned softly and slowly opened his eyes. They were dark eyes, almost black, that looked at her with a mixture of pain and distrust. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper came from his throat. "Don't try to talk," Sarah said, removing her shawl and placing it over him to protect him from the rain. "I'll take you to town. Dr. Patterson can take care of you." The man weakly grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, making her look down. He was trying to say something, his lips moving with difficulty. "No, doctor," he managed to whisper, his voice carrying an accent Sarah couldn't identify. Perhaps Italian or from the eastern United States. Not safe. Sarah frowned, confused. "You're injured. You need medical help." "They will find me," he murmured, his eyes closing again. "If you take me to town, they'll know." Sarah's mind raced. Who would find him? What had happened to him? In 1930, rural Texas was still a region where law didn't always reach, where disputes were resolved with violence, and where dangerous men could disappear without a trace. The man's expensive clothes and general appearance suggested he wasn't a common rural worker. Perhaps he was one of the businessmen who came from the east to buy cheap land during the economic crisis. She looked at her Ford, then at the injured man, making a decision that would change her life forever. "All right," she said, more to herself than to him. "I'll take you to my house, but you need to help me get to the car." With great difficulty, Sarah managed to help the man stand. He was taller and heavier than she had imagined, and each step toward the Ford was a struggle against the rain and his weakness. Blood dripped into the red mud as they walked slowly, leaving a trail that would be washed away by the rain before dawn. "What's your name?" Sarah asked as she helped him into the Ford's passenger seat. "Marco," he replied with difficulty, leaning back in the worn leather seat and closing his eyes. "Marco Benedetti." Sarah definitely noticed the Italian accent now. She adjusted the seat so he would be more comfortable and covered him with a blanket she kept in the car for cold winter nights. During the 20-minute drive to her house, Marco remained semi-conscious, occasionally murmuring words in Italian that Sarah couldn't understand. She drove as fast as the Ford allowed on the muddy road, constantly checking if he was still breathing. Sarah's house was a small, white-painted wooden construction with a covered porch and a garden where she grew vegetables to supplement her diet. It was one of the few houses in the area that had electricity, thanks to a generator the previous owner had installed. The house was isolated, surrounded by cotton fields and pastures, almost 2 kilometers from the nearest house. Helping Marco into the house was even more difficult than getting him to the car. He was losing and regaining consciousness, and Sarah had to use all her strength to keep him standing. She took him directly to her room, the only place in the house with a proper bed, and helped him lie down. Once he was safe and dry, Sarah ran to the kitchen to get hot water, clean towels, and the first aid kit she kept in the pantry. During World War I, she had worked as a volunteer at a military hospital in San Antonio, and although that was more than a decade ago, she still remembered basic wound treatment procedures. Under the bedroom's electric lamplight, Marco's wounds looked even more serious. There was a deep cut on his forehead, scratches on his arms that appeared to have been made by glass or metal, and the blood stain on his shirt revealed what appeared to be a knife wound in his abdomen. Sarah knew it was far beyond her abilities, but she did what she could to clean the wounds and stop the bleeding. "Marco," she said softly, while cleaning the cut on his forehead with a cloth soaked in alcohol. "I need to know what happened to you. Who did this?" He opened his eyes, more alert now that he was in a warm, dry environment. For a moment he just studied her, as if evaluating whether he could trust her. Sarah noticed that despite the injuries, he was a handsome man, with striking features and a presence that suggested authority and power. "You shouldn't have helped me," he said finally, his voice clearer now, though still laden with pain. "Now you're in danger too." "What kind of danger?" Sarah asked, feeling a chill in her stomach. Marco tried to sit up, grimacing in pain. "My real name is Marco Benedetti, and there are very dangerous people looking for me." Sarah stopped cleaning the wound, the bloodied cloth trembling in her hand. "What kind of people?" "The kind that kills anyone who gets in their way," Marco replied, his dark eyes meeting hers. "And now that you've helped me, they'll come after you too." The room fell silent except for the sound of rain beating against the windows and the tick-tock of the wall clock in the living room. Sarah felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She had stopped to help an injured stranger, a simple act of Christian compassion, and now discovered she had become involved in something much bigger and more dangerous than she could imagine. "Who are these people?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marco closed his eyes, as if gathering strength to tell a story he preferred to forget. "My family," he said bitterly. "My own family wants me dead." Sarah sat heavily in the wooden chair beside the bed, trying to process what she was hearing. In 1930, she had heard stories about Italian criminal families operating in the big eastern cities, but never imagined something like that could reach rural Texas. "Your family," she repeated, incredulous. "The Benedetti family," Marco said, his voice loaded with bitterness. We're one of the most powerful families in New York. My father, Salvatore Benedetti, controls much of the city's illegal business. Alcohol smuggling, gambling, protection, everything. Sarah knew about prohibition, of course. Everyone knew alcohol had been illegal since 1920, but also knew that didn't stop people from drinking. There were rumors that even the county sheriff occasionally turned a blind eye to certain activities, as long as they didn't cause problems in the community. "And you?" she asked. "Were you also involved in these businesses?" Marco looked at her with an expression that mixed shame and defiance. "I was born into this life. I had no choice. But when I discovered what my father really did, the people he hurt, I couldn't be part of it anymore." "Then, what did you discover?" "He was cutting alcohol with industrial methanol," Marco said, his voice growing stronger with anger. "Methanol is poisonous. It causes blindness, brain damage, death. When I confronted him about it, he said it was just business." Marco's voice became harder. "But it wasn't just business for the families being destroyed. I met a woman in Little Italy, Maria Rossi, who lost her husband and 2 children because of the poisoned alcohol we sold. She begged me to stop, said there were dozens of other families suffering. And you tried to convince your father to stop." "I tried," Marco said bitterly. "I told him we were crossing a line, that there was a difference between breaking the law and murdering innocent people. He told me I was getting weak, that I needed to remember where my loyalty lay." Sarah could see the pain in Marco's eyes as he continued. "So I started sabotaging the operations. I warned police about shipments, destroyed batches of adulterated alcohol, tried to protect the people my father was hurting. I thought I could change him from the inside out. But he found out. My brother Antonio turned me in," Marco said, his voice full of betrayal. "Antonio was always the favorite son, the one who followed orders without question. When he discovered what I was doing, he went straight to our father." Marco unconsciously touched the wound on his abdomen. "Salvatore called me to a meeting at one of our warehouses in Brooklyn. Said he wanted to discuss the family's future. When I got there were 6 men waiting for me, including Antonio. Did they try to kill you immediately?" "No," Marco said, his voice growing colder. "First, my father wanted me to beg for forgiveness, to promise I would never betray them again. When I refused, he gave the order." Sarah imagined the scene, a son being betrayed by his own family, forced to fight for his life against people he should be able to trust. "How did you escape?" "Luck and desperation," Marco replied. "I managed to grab a knife from one of the men and fight my way out. I stole a car that was parked outside and drove south. I thought if I could reach Mexico, I could disappear. But the car broke down, about 10 kilometers from here. I tried to walk, but I was losing too much blood. The last thing I remember is falling on the road during the storm." Sarah processed all the information. "And now? Will your family keep looking for you?" "Salvatore Benedetti never lets a betrayal go unpunished," Marco said grimly. "He'll send men to find me, no matter how long it takes or how far I go. And now that you've helped me, now I'm also a target," Sarah finished. "You already said that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Outside, Sarah could hear the normal sounds of a rural morning: birds singing, the distant lowing of cattle, the noise of a tractor on a nearby farm. It was hard to believe that her peaceful life had been completely turned upside down in a single night. "There's something you need to understand," Marco said finally. "My father has contacts throughout the country. Politicians, police officers, judges. Many people owe favors to the Benedetti family. If he wants to find me, he will." "How much time do you think we have?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. It depends on how quickly they can trace the car here. Maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks. But they'll come." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking at the dirt road leading to her house. For now, it was empty, but she knew that would change soon. "So what do we do?" she asked, surprising herself with her determination. "Do we run?" Marco looked at her with an expression of surprise and admiration. "You're really willing to help me, even knowing the danger?" Sarah thought about the question. She could turn Marco over to the authorities or simply ask him to leave her house. It would be the sensible thing to do. But when she looked at him, injured, betrayed by his own family, trying to do the right thing in a world that didn't reward morality, she knew she couldn't abandon him. "You tried to protect innocent people," she said. "That counts for something, even if it means putting your own life at risk." Sarah thought about her life before that night, working at the diner, saving pennies, dreaming of a future that always seemed out of reach. It wasn't much of a life, but it was safe and predictable. "Maybe it's time I stopped living in fear," she said finally. Marco smiled for the first time since she had found him, and Sarah realized how it completely transformed his face. Despite everything that had happened, despite the danger awaiting them, she felt a strange sense of hope. "Then we need a plan," Marco said, "and we need to move fast." But before they could discuss their next steps, the sound of car engines in the distance made them freeze. Sarah ran to the front window and saw a cloud of dust approaching along the road. 2 black cars driving at high speed toward her house. "They're here," she whispered, her blood freezing. Marco tried to get up from the bed, grimacing in pain. "Impossible, not so fast." But as the cars approached, Sarah could see they weren't Salvatore Benedetti's men. The front car was Sheriff Morrison's Ford Model T, followed by Deputy Jackson's Chevrolet. It was local law enforcement, not the New York Mafia. "It's the sheriff," Sarah said, feeling a mixture of relief and new concern. "That might be even worse," Marco said. "If they find me here, you'll be arrested for harboring a fugitive." Sarah looked at Marco, then at the approaching cars, and made a decision that would seal both their fates. "Hide in the basement," she said quickly. "There's an entrance behind the pantry and the kitchen. Don't make any noise, no matter what you hear." As Marco moved painfully toward the kitchen, Sarah quickly made the bed and hid any evidence that someone had been in the room. She threw Marco's bloody clothes into the wood stove and burned them, then quickly washed her hands and face. When Sheriff Morrison knocked on the door, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to look as if she had just woken up. "Good morning, Sheriff," she said, opening the door with a smile she hoped looked natural. "Good morning, Sarah," Sheriff Morrison replied, a corpulent 50-year-old man with a graying mustache. "Sorry to bother you so early, but we're investigating an abandoned car found on the road last night. Tom Bradley said you passed by around the same time." "Yes, I was coming home from work," Sarah said, "but I didn't see any abandoned car." Deputy Jackson, a younger, thinner man, was looking around the property with suspicious eyes. "You didn't see anything unusual? No strangers in the area?" "No, nothing," Sarah lied. "It was raining very hard. I could barely see the road in front of me." Sheriff Morrison nodded, but Sarah could see he was studying her face carefully. "Well, if you see anything suspicious, let us know immediately. We believe there may be smugglers in the area, and they can be dangerous. Of course, Sheriff, I'll keep my eyes open. After the police left, Sarah waited until she could no longer see their cars before calling Marco from the basement. He emerged slowly, clearly in pain from the effort of hiding. Do they suspect anything? He asked. I'm not sure, Sarah admitted, but we don't have much time. If your family has contacts in the police, they'll soon know that local police are looking for you. Marco nodded grimly. Then we need to get out of here, today. Where to? Mexico, Marco said, without hesitation. It's the only place where I might have a chance to disappear completely. Sarah looked around her small house, the home she had built for herself over the past 6 years. Leaving everything behind would be like dying and being reborn as a completely different person. How much time do you need to get ready? Marco asked, correctly interpreting her silence. Sarah took a deep breath, making the decision that would change her life forever. Give me an hour, she said. And as the sun rose over the Texas cotton fields, Sarah Martinez began packing for a journey that would take her far from everything she knew, toward an uncertain future, alongside a man who had chosen conscience over family, morality over loyalty. She didn't know that hundreds of kilometers away, Salvatore Benedetti had already sent his best men to Texas, and they were approaching faster than anyone could imagine. The race for survival was just beginning. Dawn came slowly over the Texas cotton fields, painting the sky in pink and golden tones that contrasted dramatically with the darkness of the previous night's events. Sarah had spent the last few hours sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching Marco sleep restlessly, occasionally waking from nightmares that made him mutter words in Italian and thrash about as if still fighting invisible attackers. She had managed to clean and bandage most of his wounds using the limited supplies she had at home. The cut on his forehead had stopped bleeding, and she had managed to stitch the abdominal wound with sewing thread sterilized on the stove, a technique she had learned during her days as a volunteer at the military hospital. Marco had lost a lot of blood, but his wounds didn't appear to be fatal if treated properly. As morning light filtered through the cotton curtains, Sarah prepared strong coffee in the kitchen, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and lack of sleep. The reality of what had happened was beginning to set in. She had given shelter to a fugitive from the New York Mafia, and now her life was in danger. The sound of footsteps on the front porch made her freeze. Sarah looked through the kitchen window and saw a familiar figure approaching the door. It was Tom Bradley, the rural mailman who made deliveries 3 times a week. Tom was a middle-aged man, thin and tanned by the Texas sun, who knew everyone in the region and had a habit of stopping to chat, especially with a single woman like Sarah. "Good morning, Sarah," Tom called out, knocking on the front door. "I have some letters for you and wanted to check if everything's all right. I saw your Ford on the road last night during the storm and was worried." Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to appear normal. She opened the door with a forced smile, using her body to block Tom's view into the house. "Good morning, Tom. Yes, I got home very late from work. The storm was terrible." Tom handed her 2 letters, an electric company bill and a letter from her sister in Albuquerque. He studied Sarah's face with curiosity. "You look tired, dear. Are you feeling well?" "Just a long shift at the diner," Sarah replied quickly. "Heinrich made me work very late because 2 of the other employees didn't show up." "Well, you should rest," Tom said, still looking concerned. "By the way, did you see anything strange on the road last night?" Sheriff Morrison received a report about an abandoned car found about 10 kilometers north of here. A black Ford, new model, with New York plates. Sarah's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, I didn't see anything. I was focused on not going off the road with all that rain." Tom nodded, but Sarah could see he was still curious. "Well, if you see anything suspicious, let me know. The sheriff thinks it might have been smugglers passing through the region. You know how dangerous these things are." After Tom left, Sarah quickly returned to the bedroom. Marco was awake, his dark eyes alert and focused on her. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice stronger than the night before. "The mailman," Sarah replied, sitting in the chair. "He said they found your car. The sheriff thinks it was smugglers." Marco laughed bitterly. They're not wrong. My family controls much of the alcohol smuggling on the East Coast. Ironic that now I'm mistaken for one of them. Sarah studied him in the morning light. Even injured and exhausted, there was something impressive about Marco Benedetti. He had the kind of presence that commanded attention, a natural authority that probably came from years growing up in a position of power. His hands, despite the cuts, were well cared for, and she noticed he wore an expensive gold watch on his wrist. "Tell me more about your family," she said. "If I'm going to be involved in this, I need to understand what we're dealing with." Marco sat up in bed with difficulty, leaning against the wooden headboard. The Benedetti family came to the United States in 1895, when my grandfather Giuseppe came from Sicily. He started with small businesses, a bakery, then a restaurant. But when Prohibition was passed in 1920, my father saw an opportunity. He paused to take a sip of the water Sarah had left on the nightstand. Salvatore Benedetti is an intelligent and ruthless man. He built an empire controlling alcohol imports from Canada and Europe. They have warehouses, trucks, boats, and a network of distributors that extends from Boston to Philadelphia. But it's not just about alcohol. What else? Sarah asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Illegal gambling, loan sharking, protection for businesses, anything that generates money, and when someone doesn't pay or tries to compete with us. Marco didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Sarah felt a chill. "And you grew up in this world?" "Since childhood," Marco confirmed. "My father taught me that family was everything, that our loyalty to each other was more important than any external law or morality. I believed that for a long time." "What changed?" Marco looked out the window, observing the cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. 6 months ago, I discovered that my father was cutting the alcohol with industrial methanol to increase profits. Methanol is poisonous. It causes blindness, brain damage, death. When I confronted him about it, he said it was just business. Marco's voice became harder. But it wasn't just business for the families being destroyed. I met a woman in Little Italy, Maria Rossi, who lost her husband and 2 children because of the poisoned alcohol we sold. She begged me to stop, said there were dozens of other families suffering. "And you tried to convince your father to stop?" "I tried," Marco said bitterly. "I told him we were crossing a line, that there was a difference between breaking the law and murdering innocent people. He told me I was getting weak, that I needed to remember where my loyalty lay." Sarah could see the pain in Marco's eyes as he continued. "So I started sabotaging the operations. I warned police about shipments, destroyed batches of adulterated alcohol, tried to protect the people my father was hurting. I thought I could change him from the inside, but he found out. My brother Antonio turned me in," Marco said, his voice full of betrayal. "Antonio was always the favorite son, the one who followed orders without question. When he discovered what I was doing, he went straight to our father." Marco unconsciously touched the wound on his abdomen. "Salvatore called me to a meeting at one of our warehouses in Brooklyn. Said he wanted to discuss the family's future. When I got there were 6 men waiting for me, including Antonio." "Did they try to kill you immediately?" "No," Marco said, his voice growing colder. "First, my father wanted me to beg for forgiveness, to promise I would never betray them again. When I refused, he gave the order." Sarah imagined the scene, a son being betrayed by his own family, forced to fight for his life against people he should be able to trust. "How did you escape?" "Luck and desperation," Marco replied. "I managed to grab a knife from one of the men and fight my way out. I stole a car that was parked outside and drove south. I thought if I could reach Mexico, I could disappear. But the car broke down, about 10 kilometers from here. I tried to walk, but I was losing too much blood. The last thing I remember is falling on the road during the storm." Sarah processed all the information. "And now? Will your family keep looking for you?" "Salvatore Benedetti never lets a betrayal go unpunished," Marco said grimly. "He'll send men to find me no matter how long it takes or how far I go. And now that you've helped me, now I'm also a target," Sarah finished. "You already said that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Outside, Sarah could hear the normal sounds of a rural morning: birds singing, the distant lowing of cattle, the noise of a tractor on a nearby farm. It was hard to believe that her peaceful life had been completely turned upside down in a single night. "There's something you need to understand," Marco said finally. "My father has contacts throughout the country. Politicians, police officers, judges. Many people owe favors to the Benedetti family. If he wants to find me, he will." "How much time do you think we have?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. It depends on how quickly they can trace the car here. Maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks. But they'll come." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking at the dirt road leading to her house. For now it was empty, but she knew that would change soon. "So what do we do?" she asked, surprising herself with her determination. "Do we run?" Marco looked at her with an expression of surprise and admiration. "You're really willing to help me, even knowing the danger?" Sarah thought about the question. She could turn Marco over to the authorities or simply ask him to leave her house. It would be the sensible thing to do. But when she looked at him, injured, betrayed by his own family, trying to do the right thing in a world that didn't reward morality, she knew she couldn't abandon him. "You tried to protect innocent people," she said. "That counts for something, even if it means putting your own life at risk." Sarah thought about her life before that night, working at the diner, saving pennies, dreaming of a future that always seemed out of reach. It wasn't much of a life, but it was safe and predictable. "Maybe it's time I stopped living in fear," she said finally. Marco smiled for the first time since she had found him, and Sarah realized how it completely transformed his face. Despite everything that had happened, despite the danger awaiting them, she felt a strange sense of hope. "Then we need a plan," Marco said, "and we need to move fast." But before they could discuss their next steps, the sound of car engines in the distance made them freeze. Sarah ran to the front window and saw a cloud of dust approaching along the road, 2 black cars driving at high speed toward her house. "They're here," she whispered, her blood freezing. Marco tried to get up from the bed, grimacing in pain. Impossible. Not so fast. But as the cars approached, Sarah could see they weren't Salvatore Benedetti's men. The front car was Sheriff Morrison's Ford Model T, followed by Deputy Jackson's Chevrolet. It was local law enforcement, not the New York Mafia. "It's the sheriff," Sarah said, feeling a mixture of relief and new concern. "That might be even worse," Marco said. "If they find me here, you'll be arrested for harboring a fugitive." Sarah looked at Marco, then at the approaching cars, and made a decision that would seal both their fates. "Hide in the basement," she said quickly. "There's an entrance behind the pantry and the kitchen. Don't make any noise, no matter what you hear." As Marco moved painfully toward the kitchen, Sarah quickly made the bed and hid any evidence that someone had been in the room. She threw Marco's bloody clothes into the wood stove and burned them, then quickly washed her hands and face. When Sheriff Morrison knocked on the door, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to look as if she had just woken up. "Good morning, Sheriff," she said, opening the door with a smile she hoped looked natural. "Good morning, Sarah," Sheriff Morrison replied, a corpulent 50-year-old man with a graying mustache. "Sorry to bother you so early, but we're investigating an abandoned car found on the road last night. Tom Bradley said you passed by around the same time." "Yes, I was coming home from work," Sarah said, "but I didn't see any abandoned car." Deputy Jackson, a younger, thinner man, was looking around the property with suspicious eyes. "You didn't see anything unusual? No strangers in the area?" "No, nothing," Sarah lied. "It was raining very hard. I could barely see the road in front of me." Sheriff Morrison nodded, but Sarah could see he was studying her face carefully. "Well, if you see anything suspicious, let us know immediately. We believe there may be smugglers in the area, and they can be dangerous." "Of course, Sheriff. I'll keep my eyes open." After the police left, Sarah waited until she could no longer see their cars before calling Marco from the basement. He emerged slowly, clearly in pain from the effort of hiding. "Do they suspect anything?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted, "but we don't have much time. If your family has contacts in the police, they'll soon know that local police are looking for you." Marco nodded grimly. "Then we need to get out of here. Today." "Where to?" "Mexico," Marco said, without hesitation. "It's the only place where I might have a chance to disappear completely." Sarah looked around her small house, the home she had built for herself over the past 6 years. Leaving everything behind would be like dying and being reborn as a completely different person. "How much time do you need to get ready?" Marco asked, correctly interpreting her silence. Sarah took a deep breath, making the decision that would change her life forever. "Give me an hour," she said. And as the sun rose over the Texas cotton fields, Sarah Martinez began packing for a journey that would take her far from everything she knew, toward an uncertain future, alongside a man who had chosen conscience over family, morality over loyalty. She didn't know that hundreds of kilometers away, Salvatore Benedetti had already sent his best men to Texas, and they were approaching faster than anyone could imagine. The race for survival was just beginning. The midday October sun beat mercilessly on the dirt road as Sarah finished loading her few possessions into the Ford Model A. She had chosen only the essentials: some changes of clothes, her personal documents, the savings she kept in a coffee can hidden behind the stove, about $200 she had saved over 3 years, and the .38 pistol that had belonged to her late father, along with a box of ammunition. Marco sat in the passenger seat, wearing clothes borrowed from Sarah, a blue cotton work shirt and pants that had belonged to the house's former tenant. The clothes were a bit loose on him, but at least they didn't attract attention like his expensive bloodied suit. Sarah had bandaged his wounds more carefully, using clean bandages and iodine she had bought at the town pharmacy the previous week. "Are you sure about the route?" Sarah asked while checking the gas level. The tank was almost full. Lucky, considering gas stations were scarce on rural Texas roads. Marco studied the road map Sarah had found in the kitchen drawer. "We need to avoid the main roads. My father will have men checking all the obvious routes to Mexico. I suggest we go west through San Antonio, then south through Laredo. That will add at least 100 kilometers to the trip," Sarah observed. "Better to arrive alive and late than not arrive at all," Marco replied grimly. Sarah nodded and started the engine. The Ford rumbled to life, and she drove slowly along the dirt road leading away from her house. When she looked in the rearview mirror and saw the small white house disappearing behind the trees, she felt a pang of sadness. That had been her first real home, the first place where she had felt truly safe since leaving New Mexico. "Do you regret it?" Marco asked, noticing her expression. "Ask me again when we're safe," Sarah replied, focusing on the road ahead. They drove in silence for the first few kilometers, both lost in their own thoughts. The rural Texas landscape stretched around them, cotton fields ready for harvest, pastures where cattle sheltered under sparse trees, and occasional farms with wooden houses and red barns. It was a world Sarah knew well, a world she was leaving behind perhaps forever. When they reached the first crossroads, Sarah turned west toward San Antonio, avoiding the main road that led directly south. The secondary road was more potholed and dusty, but there was less traffic, just a few farm trucks and the occasional traveler. "Tell me about your life before last night," Marco said after an hour of travel. "How did you end up in Texas?" Sarah kept her eyes on the road as she spoke. "I was born in New Mexico, in a small town called Las Cruces. My father was a blacksmith, my mother a seamstress. We were poor but happy. When I was 19, my parents tried to force me to marry the son of a wealthy rancher in the region. You didn't want to marry him. He was violent," Sarah said simply. "He beat horses, dogs, the workers on his ranch. I knew that if I married him, I would just be another thing for him to beat." Marco nodded, understanding. "So you ran away?" "One night I took what I could carry and caught the first train east. I ended up in Austin, then moved to Cedar Creek when I found work at the diner. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was mine. And now you're leaving all that behind for a stranger," Marco observed. Sarah glanced at him quickly before returning her attention to the road. "You're not a stranger anymore. And besides, maybe it's time I stopped running and started fighting." They stopped for lunch in a small town called Fredericksburg, A German settlement with stone houses and a population that maintained their European traditions. Sarah chose a small cafe away from the main street, where they could eat without attracting attention. The owner, an elderly man with a heavy German accent, served them potato soup and homemade bread. Sarah noticed he looked at Marco with curiosity. Even in simple clothes, there was something about Marco that suggested he wasn't a common rural worker. "Are you traveling far?" the owner asked while serving coffee. "San Antonio," Sarah replied quickly. "My husband has family there." Marco didn't correct the lie about being married, but Sarah saw a small smile touch his lips. "Difficult times to travel," the German commented. "I heard there are problems with smugglers in the region. Police are stopping many cars." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of problems?" "They found an abandoned car with New York plates. The sheriff thinks it might be gangsters fleeing from Eastern police. They're checking all strangers in the area." Marco and Sarah exchanged quick glances. If the news had already spread to other towns, it meant the search was intensifying. "Well," Sarah said, forcing a smile, "we hope we won't have problems. We're just ordinary people." After lunch, they quickly returned to the car. Marco studied the map while Sarah drove out of town. "We need to change our plans," he said. "If they're checking strangers in all small towns, secondary roads might be more dangerous than main ones." "What do you suggest?" "Let's take Highway 90. It's busier, but we can blend in with other travelers. And if we're stopped, our story about going to visit family in San Antonio will be more believable." Sarah nodded and turned north toward the main road. When they reached Highway 90, she felt more exposed. There were more cars, more people who could notice them, but Marco was right. They blended better with the constant flow of traffic. It was 4 in the afternoon when they saw the first sign of real trouble. Sarah was driving at a steady speed when she noticed 2 black cars in the rear-view mirror, maintaining a constant distance behind them. Initially, she thought it was coincidence, but after 20 minutes, the cars were still there. "Marco," she said calmly, "I think we're being followed." Marco turned discreetly to look back. 2 black cars, new Buicks. "Yes." "Shit," Marco muttered. "Those aren't local police. They're my father's men." Sarah's heart raced. How did they find us so fast? Salvatore has contacts everywhere. He probably bribed someone in the local police to get information about cars with Texas plates that passed through the area where they found my car. Sarah looked at the speedometer. The Ford was doing about 50 kilometers per hour, its safe maximum speed. The Buicks behind them could easily overtake them if they wanted. "Why aren't they catching up to us?" she asked. "They probably want to see where we're going first. Or they're waiting for a more isolated place to stop us." Ahead, Sarah could see a gas station with a small attached store. There were several cars parked there, including a state police truck. "There," she said, pointing. "There are police officers." "No," Marco said quickly. "We don't know if we can trust them. And if we stop, we'll confirm that we are who they think we are." "So what do we do?" Marco thought quickly. "There's a secondary road about 5 kilometers ahead. When we get there, turn sharply without signaling. If we can gain some distance, we can try to lose them on rural roads." Sarah nodded, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The next 5 kilometers seemed like an eternity. The black cars maintained their distance, like predators waiting for the right moment to attack. When Sarah saw the secondary road, she took a deep breath and turned sharply to the right without warning. The Ford skidded slightly on the turn, but she managed to maintain control. Behind them, she heard the sound of brakes and horns as the Buicks tried to make the same turn at high speed. One of them managed to follow, but the other went straight and had to make a U-turn. "Good!" Marco shouted. "Now accelerate!" Sarah floored the accelerator, pushing the Ford to its maximum. The engine groaned with the effort, but the car gained speed. The secondary road was narrow and full of curves, which gave the lighter, more maneuverable Ford an advantage. For 20 minutes, they raced through the rural landscape, raising clouds of dust and passing isolated farms. Sarah drove with a skill she didn't know she possessed, taking curves at dangerous speeds and navigating roads she barely knew. But the Buicks were more powerful and gradually began to gain ground. "They're getting closer," Marco said, looking back. Sarah could see the first Buick in the rear-view mirror, now only 100 meters away. The second had managed to catch up and was right behind the first. "There!" Marco shouted, pointing to a dirt road branching to the left. "Turn there!" Sarah turned sharply, and the Ford jumped from the paved road onto the dirt. The change of surface made the car skid violently, but she managed to maintain control. The dirt road led through a dense forest, with trees on both sides creating a green tunnel. It was too narrow for the Buicks to pass side by side, which gave Sarah and Marco a small advantage. But the advantage didn't last long. The first Buick entered the dirt road behind them, followed by the second, and now Sarah could hear something that made her blood freeze. The sound of gunshots. "Get down!" Marco shouted when the Ford's rear window exploded. Sarah ducked as low as she could while still being able to drive. More shots echoed through the forest, and she felt the car shake when one of the bullets hit the rear fender. "There's a bridge ahead," Marco shouted. "I can see water." Sarah strained her eyes through the cracked windshield and saw what Marco was talking about, a narrow wooden bridge crossing a stream. It was old and looked fragile, but it was their only option. "Hold on," she shouted, accelerating toward the bridge. The Ford hit the bridge at high speed, the wooden planks groaning under the weight. For a terrible moment, Sarah thought the bridge would collapse, but it held. On the other side of the bridge, the road split in 3 directions. Sarah chose the middle one without thinking, just wanting to put distance between them and their pursuers. Behind them, she heard a loud crash followed by shouts. Looking in the rear-view mirror, she saw that the first Buick had tried to cross the bridge too fast and had broken through the planks, getting stuck with its front wheels hanging over the stream. The second Buick stopped at the edge of the bridge, its occupants getting out to assess the situation. "We did it!" Sarah shouted, feeling a wave of relief and adrenaline. But Marco wasn't celebrating. "That only buys us time," he said grimly. "They'll call for reinforcements. And now they definitely know we're heading south." Sarah drove for another hour through increasingly isolated rural roads before finally stopping in a clearing hidden among trees. Both were trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. "We can't keep going like this," Sarah said, turning off the engine. "They have better cars, more men, more resources. Eventually they'll catch us." Marco nodded, studying the map in the late afternoon light. "You're right. We need a different strategy." "What do you have in mind?" "There's a town called Uvalde, about 50 kilometers south of here. It has a train station. If we can get there, we can abandon the car and take a train to El Paso. And from El Paso, we cross the border on foot. Once in Mexico, we can disappear." Sarah looked at the damaged Ford, the destroyed rear window, bullet holes in the metal, the engine making strange noises. "Do you think this car will make it to Uvalde?" "It has to," Marco said. "It's our only chance." As the sun began to set over Texas, painting the sky in orange and red tones, Sarah started the engine again. The Ford coughed and groaned, but caught. "Uvalde," she said, putting the car in motion. "Better be our salvation." But as they drove through the increasingly dark landscape, neither of them knew that Salvatore Benedetti had sent more than just 2 cars to Texas. A network of hunters was closing around them, and the train station in Uvalde was already being watched. The escape was far from over. In fact, the most dangerous part was just beginning. And somewhere behind them in the growing darkness, engines roared as more black cars joined the hunt. Darkness had completely swallowed the Texan landscape when Sarah and Marco finally spotted the lights of Uvalde in the distance. The Ford Model A had managed to complete the journey, but just barely. The engine was overheating, making worrying noises, and one of the bullets had punctured the radiator, causing a slow leak that had forced them to stop 3 times to add water. Sarah drove slowly through the town's outskirts, avoiding the main street where the train station was located. Uvalde was a larger town than Cedar Creek, with about 3,000 inhabitants, paved streets in the center, and even some electric street lights. It was the type of place where strangers would be noticed, but also where it would be easier to blend in with other travelers. "Stop there," Marco said, pointing to a small hotel 2 blocks from the station. "Hotel Garza. Looks discreet." Sarah parked the damaged Ford behind the hotel, where it wouldn't be easily visible from the street. Hotel Garza was a two-story red brick building, built in the Spanish colonial style common in the region. A faded wooden sign swayed in the night breeze, and yellow light leaked from the ground floor windows. "We'll register as husband and wife," Marco said as they approached the entrance. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez from Austin. We're visiting relatives before continuing to El Paso." Sarah nodded, adjusting her hair and trying to look like a tired wife from traveling instead of a woman fleeing from the Mafia. They entered the small lobby where a middle-aged Mexican man sat behind a wooden counter, reading a newspaper in Spanish. "Good evening," Sarah said in her best Spanish. "We need a room for the night." The man, who introduced himself as Señor Garza, studied them briefly before pushing a registration book toward them. $2 for the night, payment in advance. Marco signed as Miguel Rodriguez in handwriting different from his natural one, and paid with some of the crumpled bills Sarah had brought from her savings. "Is there anywhere we can get food?" Sarah asked. "We've been traveling all day. My wife can prepare something simple," Señor Garza replied. "Tacos, beans, coffee, $1 extra. "Perfect," Marco said. Their room was on the second floor, small but clean, with an iron bed, a wooden dresser, and a window overlooking the side street. Sarah discreetly checked the view. She could see part of the train station at the end of the street, and noticed there was more activity than she would expect for a small town at 10 at night. "There's a lot of activity at the station," she observed, while Marco sat heavily on the bed, clearly exhausted and still feeling pain from his wounds. Marco joined her at the window, peeking through the cotton curtains. "You're right. I see at least 6 men standing around the main entrance. And those 2 cars parked there." Sarah followed his gaze and saw 2 black Buicks parked near the station. "They're the same types of cars that chased us." "My father got here before us," Marco said grimly. "He must have guessed we'd try to catch a train." A soft knock on the door made them freeze. Sarah opened carefully, finding Señora Garza, a small, robust woman carrying a tray of food. "Susana," she said with a warm smile, entering to place the tray on the small table near the window. "Gracias, señora," Sarah replied, giving her a 50-cent tip. After the woman left, Sarah and Marco ate in silence, both lost in thoughts about their increasingly desperate situation. The tacos were delicious, homemade tortillas filled with seasoned meat and fresh vegetables. But Sarah could barely taste the food due to anxiety. "We can't stay here," Marco said finally. "If they're watching the station, they're probably also checking hotels. So what do? We can't go back. They'll be watching all the roads too." Marco stood and walked to the window again, studying the town below. "There's another option. We can try to cross the border on foot, without using the train station." "On foot? How many kilometers is it to the border?" "About 150 kilometers to Laredo. But there are smaller towns along the Rio Grande where the border is less guarded." Sarah calculated mentally. "That would take days, maybe a week. And we don't have supplies for such a journey. It's better than being caught here." Before Sarah could respond, they heard the sound of cars stopping in front of the hotel. Male voices echoed from the lobby, speaking in English with northeastern United States accents. "We're looking for a man and a woman," said a rough voice. "The man is injured, driving a Ford with bullet damage." Sarah and Marco looked at each other, panic rising in their throats. "I haven't seen anyone like that," Señor Garza's voice replied, but there was nervousness in his tone. "Mind if we take a look?" The question was clearly an order, not a request. Of course, but please don't disturb my other guests." The sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs made Marco move quickly. He grabbed Sarah's pistol from her bag and checked if it was loaded. "The window," he whispered. "We can go down through the annex roof." Sarah carefully opened the window and looked out. There was a slanted roof about 2 meters below, leading to a 1-story annex where the hotel kitchen was located. From the annex roof, it would be possible to jump into the alley behind the building. The footsteps were approaching their corridor. Sarah could hear doors being opened and voices protesting from other guests being awakened. "Let's go," Marco whispered, helping Sarah out the window first. Sarah hung from the window ledge for a moment before letting herself drop onto the annex roof. The clay tiles made noise under her feet, but she managed to keep her balance. Marco followed her, moving more slowly due to his injuries. They had just reached the edge of the annex roof when they heard their room door being violently opened. "They were here," said a voice. "The food is still warm." "Check the window!" Sarah and Marco dropped from the roof into the alley, a fall of about 3 meters that made Marco groan in pain when he landed. Sarah helped him up, and they ran through the dark alley toward the parallel street. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of more cars arriving. Lights came on in windows around the hotel as the commotion awakened the neighborhood. "This way," Sarah whispered, pulling Marco toward a row of closed shops. They hid in the entrance of a hardware store, pressing against the wooden door in the darkness. Cars passed down the street, headlights sweeping the sidewalks. Sarah could see men getting out of vehicles, spreading through the area in a systematic search. "How many men did your father send?" she whispered. "At least a dozen from what I can see," Marco replied. "He really wants to make sure I don't escape this time." They waited in the darkness for almost an hour, watching the hunters scour the town. Gradually, activity decreased as the men regrouped near the train station and hotel. "They'll keep guards at all exit points from town," Marco said. "Roads, train station, even the trails leading to the countryside." "So how do we get out of here?" Marco sought for a moment. "There's one thing they might not be expecting. We can hide until they lower their guard, then try to leave during the day when there's more movement in town." "Hide where?" "The church," Marco said, pointing to a stone structure with a bell tower at the end of the street. "Churches always have places to hide, and most people wouldn't think to look for fugitives on sacred ground." Sarah looked at the Church of San Antonio, a Spanish colonial construction that dominated Uvalde's central square. It was risky, but maybe that's exactly why it would work. "How do we get there without being seen?" "Through the alleys. I know towns like this. There's always a network of alleys behind the shops that leads to the central square." They moved carefully through the shadows, using alleys and passages between buildings to avoid the main streets. It took almost 30 minutes to cover the 3 blocks to the church, stopping frequently to hide when they heard cars or voices. The Church of San Antonio was an impressive structure, built in the 18th century by Spanish missionaries. Its limestone walls were thick, and colored stained glass windows glowed faintly in the starlight. The main door was locked, but Marco found a side entrance that led to the sacristy. "Do you know how to pick locks?" Sarah asked, impressed when Marco managed to open the door with a hairpin she had. "Growing up in a criminal family has its advantages," he replied dryly. The church interior was plunged in darkness, illuminated only by votive candles that burned constantly near the altar. The smell of incense and candle wax created an atmosphere of peace that contrasted dramatically with the danger surrounding them. "There," Marco whispered, pointing to a wooden staircase leading to the choir on the 2nd floor. "We can see the street from there, and there's less chance of being discovered." They carefully climbed the creaking stairs and settled behind the pipe organ, where they had a clear view of the square through a small window. From there, they could see the train station, the hotel, and several of the town's main streets. "Now we wait," Marco said, settling against the stone wall. Sarah sat beside him, finally allowing herself to relax a bit for the first time in hours. "Marco," she said softly, "what happens if we can't get out of here?" Marco looked at her in the dim light. "You can still turn yourself in. Say I forced you to help me. My father can be cruel, but he doesn't hurt innocents without reason." "I'm not innocent," Sarah said. "I chose to help you, and I won't abandon you now." "Why?" Marco asked. "Why are you risking your life for someone you met only 2 days ago?" Sarah thought about the question. "Because you tried to do the right thing, even when it meant going against your own family. That takes courage. And because," she hesitated, "because for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Marco reached out and gently touched her face. "You're an extraordinary woman, Sarah Martinez." For a moment they looked at each other in the darkness, and Sarah felt something move between them, something deeper than the camaraderie of fugitives. But before either could speak, the sound of cars in the square brought them back to reality. 3 black Buicks had stopped in front of the church. Men in dark suits got out of the cars, and Sarah could see that at least 2 of them carried Thompson rifles, the machine guns that had become the trademark of gangsters during the Prohibition era. "They're going to search the church," Marco whispered. "Is there another place to hide?" Marco looked around the choir, then pointed to an even narrower staircase leading to the bell tower. "Up there. But if they find us there, there'll be nowhere to run." The sound of the church's main door being opened echoed through the sacred space. Male voices reverberated among the stone columns as Salvatore Benedetti's men began their search. Sarah and Marco silently climbed to the bell tower, their breathing sounding too loud in their own ears. From the top of the tower, they could see all of Uvalde spread below them, but they were also completely trapped. Below, they could hear the hunters' footsteps approaching the choir stairs. "Sarah," Marco whispered, "if they find us, I'll try to distract them. When that happens, you run. I won't leave you. Please. One of us needs to survive to tell this story." But before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice echoed through the church, a voice that made Marco's blood freeze. "Marco!" the voice shouted. "I know you're there. It's time to come home, little brother." It was Antonio Benedetti. The brother who had betrayed Marco was personally leading the hunt, and now there was nowhere left to run. Antonio Benedetti's voice echoed through the church like a ghost from the past, laden with a mixture of authority and false fraternal affection. Marco closed his eyes for a moment, childhood memories flooding his mind. He and Antonio playing in the streets of Little Italy, sharing secrets, protecting each other from neighborhood bullies. Now that same brother had come to kill him. "Marco!" Antonio shouted again, his voice echoing among the stone columns of the church. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Papa is willing to talk. Maybe we can work this out as a family." Sarah looked at Marco in the darkness of the bell tower, seeing the pain in his eyes. She could hear footsteps climbing the wooden stairs toward the choir, each step bringing them closer to discovery. "He's lying," Sarah whispered. "I know," Marco replied, his voice heavy with sadness. "Antonio was always a good liar, but he's also my brother." Below they could hear the men searching the choir, moving benches and checking behind the organ. It was only a matter of time before someone looked up and saw the staircase leading to the bell tower. Marco made a decision. He slowly stood up, checked his pistol one last time, and looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed determination and despair. "I'm going down," he said. "Maybe if I surrender, they'll let you go." "No," Sarah whispered fiercely, grabbing his arm. "I won't let you do that. Sarah, listen to me. You have a whole life ahead of you. I chose this path when I decided to oppose my family. But you don't have to die because of my choices." Before Sarah could protest, a new voice joined the chorus below, an older, more authoritative voice that made Marco pale. "My son," the voice said, heavy with a thick Italian accent. "Your father came personally to take you home." Salvatore Benedetti had arrived in Uvalde. Marco leaned against the bell tower's stone wall as if he had taken a punch to the stomach. "He came," he whispered. "My father actually came." Sarah could hear the reverence and fear in Marco's voice. Even after everything that had happened, even knowing that Salvatore wanted to kill him, Marco still felt the weight of paternal authority. "Marco Benedetti!" Salvatore shouted, his voice echoing through the church with the force of thunder. "You have brought dishonor to our family, but you are still my blood. Come down now, and perhaps we can find a solution that doesn't end in tragedy." "He's lying too," Sarah said. "You know he is." "Yes," Marco admitted. "But maybe if I explain about the poisoned alcohol, about the families that were dying." "Marco," Sarah held his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Men like your father don't change. They don't feel remorse. If you go down, he'll kill you, and then he'll kill me too." Below, they could hear Salvatore giving orders in Italian. Footsteps spread through the church as more men arrived to surround the building. "Find them," Salvatore said in English. "Search every inch of this church." That's when Sarah heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of sirens approaching. Many sirens. "The police," she whispered. Marco heard it too, and a cautious expression of hope crossed his face. Someone must have called the authorities when they saw all these cars and armed men in town. Below, they could hear confusion and urgent voices. Salvatore was shouting orders in Italian, and there was the sound of people moving quickly. "They'll try to get out before the police arrive," Marco said. "This might be our chance." But before they could move, they heard footsteps on the staircase leading to the bell tower. Someone had finally thought to check up there. Marco positioned himself in front of Sarah, pistol in hand, as a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a young man in a dark suit, carrying a Thompson submachine gun. "Here they are!" the man shouted. Marco didn't hesitate. He fired once, hitting the man in the shoulder and making him fall back down the stairs. The sound of the shot echoed through the church like thunder. "Marco!" Antonio shouted from below. "Don't be stupid! You're surrounded!" The sirens were louder now, clearly approaching the central square. Sarah could see flashing lights through the bell tower windows. "Texas State Police!" An amplified voice echoed from outside the church. "Come out with your hands up!" What happened next was chaos. Gunfire exploded from inside and outside the church as Salvatore's men tried to fight the police. Sarah and Marco crouched on the bell tower floor, covering their heads as bullets ricocheted off the stone walls around them. The battle lasted almost 20 minutes. Sarah could hear screams, orders being shouted in English and Italian, and the constant sound of gunfire. Several times, men tried to climb the stairs to the bell tower, but Marco managed to keep them away. Finally, silence descended over the church. "Anyone up there?" shouted a voice with a Texan accent. "This is Captain Rodriguez of the State Police. Come out slowly with your hands up." Marco and Sarah looked at each other. After everything they had been through, it was hard to believe it could be over. "Let's go," Marco said, holstering his pistol. "I think it's finally over." They slowly descended the stairs, hands raised. The church interior was filled with gunpowder smoke, and there was broken glass scattered across the floor. Several men in dark suits lay motionless among the pews, and others were being handcuffed by state police officers. In the center of the nave, Sarah saw two figures she recognized from Marco's descriptions. Antonio Benedetti sat on a pew, holding a bloody arm, his face a mask of anger and defeat. Beside him, an older man with graying hair and eyes cold as ice was being handcuffed. Salvatore Benedetti. When Salvatore saw Marco coming down the stairs, his eyes narrowed with a fury that made Sarah shudder. "You brought the police down on your own family," Salvatore said, his voice laden with venom. "You are no longer my son." Marco stopped in front of his father, and for a moment Sarah thought he might crumble under the weight of those words. But then Marco straightened, and when he spoke, his voice was firm. "You stopped being my father the moment you decided that money was more important than human lives," Marco said. "I'd rather have no family at all than have a family of murderers." Salvatore spat on the ground at Marco's feet, but before he could respond, the police led him away. Captain Rodriguez, a middle-aged man with a graying mustache, approached Marco and Sarah. "Are you Marco Benedetti and Sarah Martinez?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Marco replied. "We have a lot to discuss," the captain said. "But first, you need medical attention, and then you're going to tell me everything about the Benedetti family operations." 6 months later, El Paso, Texas. Sarah Martinez, now Sarah Benedetti, stood on the porch of her new house, watching the sunset paint the mountains of West Texas in golden and red tones. The house was small but comfortable, located in a quiet El Paso neighborhood, far enough from her previous life to feel safe, but still in Texas, which had truly become her home. Marco came out of the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, still limping slightly from his wounds, which had healed well, but left some permanent limitations. He sat beside Sarah on the porch swing, putting an arm around her. "How was the trial today?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer from the smile on his face. "Salvatore got life in prison," Marco said with satisfaction. "Antonio too. And with the testimonies we provided, they managed to dismantle the entire family operation on the East Coast." Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew Marco still felt pain from his family's betrayal, even knowing he had done the right thing. And the families that were poisoned by the adulterated alcohol, she asked. The federal government is creating a compensation fund using assets confiscated from the Benedetti family. It won't bring back the dead, but at least it will help the survivors. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the Texas sky. Sarah thought about how her life had completely changed in just 6 months. She had gone from being a lonely waitress in a small town to becoming the wife of a man who had risked everything to do what was right. "Do you regret it?" Marco asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Which part?" Sarah replied with a smile. "Stopping to help an injured stranger on the road? Running from the Mafia? Marrying you in a civil ceremony in El Paso while you were still recovering from gunshot wounds? Any of those things." Sarah turned to look at him, seeing the man he had become, no longer the rebellious son of a Mafia boss, but a man who had found peace with himself and his choices. "Not for a second," she said, kissing him softly. Marco had gotten a job as an accountant at a local construction company, using the skills he had learned managing the Benedetti family finances for legal purposes. Sarah had returned to studying, using part of the reward money they received for helping dismantle the criminal organization to pay for nursing courses. "You know," Marco said, "sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night." "You would have died on the road," Sarah said simply, "and you'd still be serving coffee at the diner in Cedar Creek, and would never have met the love of my life," Sarah added. They swayed gently on the porch as night fell over El Paso. Somewhere in the city, a radio played Mexican music, and the smell of home cooking floated in the night air. "Marco," Sarah said after a while, "do you think we made a difference? That all this was worth it?" Marco thought about the question, remembering the families that had been saved when the poisoned alcohol operation was shut down, the criminals who were now behind bars, and the new life he and Sarah had built together. "Yes," he said finally, "I think we did." And as the stars shone over Texas, Sarah Martinez Benedetti knew she had found not just love, but also her purpose. Sometimes, she reflected, life's best decisions are made in moments of spontaneous compassion, like stopping to help an injured stranger on a dark road during a storm. That decision had cost her old life, but had given her something much more valuable, a life that was truly worth living. On the horizon, the lights of Juarez, Mexico, twinkled like earthly stars, reminding them of how close they had come to crossing that border as desperate fugitives. Now, they saw it simply as neighbors in a new life they had built together, a life based on truth, justice, and the love that had flourished under the most unlikely circumstances. The waitress and the Mafia son had found their redemption in each other, and in 1930s Texas, that was all that mattered.